Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Monday, May 13th, 2024. National Security Adviser Jake Sullivan has an assessment of where the war between Israel and Hamas stands. Asked about Israel not taking seriously President Joe Biden's threat to limit weapons transfers if there is a major assault on the southern Gaza city of Rafah. State Department Deputy Spokesperson Vedant Patel questioned about the report that came out Friday that says no firm conclusions have been made about whether Israel has violated international humanitarian law in Gaza, but potentially it has. Maryland holds its primary election on Tuesday. We'll talk with Baltimore Banner state politics reporter Pamela Wood about the race for the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate between Congressman David Trone and County Executive Angela Alsobrooks, with the winner expected to face the likely Republican nominee, former Governor Larry Hogan. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, approves new requirements for moving electricity across states and paying for new transmission projects. It's a priority for the Biden administration in its goals of making the electrical grid more resilient and distributing more clean power to transition away from fossil fuels. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen talking about the 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and other tariffs on Chinese imports, including semiconductors, all expected to be announced by the Biden administration this week, and also how China may respond. And Vice President Kamala Harris using profanity to emphasize the importance of equal access and opportunity. She was speaking at the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies conference in Washington. Story from CNN, White House National Security Adviser Jake Sullivan said Monday that the ongoing ceasefire negotiations continue urgently and that the administration remains intent and determined to help Israel and Hamas reach a deal and secure the release of hostages. He said, "I can't predict when and if that will happen. I can tell you that we remain committed to pressing the diplomacy to achieve that outcome. We will now have to see how things unfold in the coming days." He said this particular negotiation has had its ups and downs, its ins and outs, its twists and turns. Sullivan also said it's his belief that Israel can and must do more to protect civilians in Gaza, and that the U.S. government still believes a Rafah operation would be a mistake. That was from CNN, talking about Jake Sullivan at the White House briefing. Here is a portion.
Are the Israelis giving for why they continue to push forward in Rafah? And do you get the sense that they're taking the U.S. warning and threat seriously?
Look, I think that they have taken the sustained conversation that we have had with them about how to seek an enduring defeat for Hamas while minimizing civilian harm. I think they have been taking that seriously. We've had multiple rounds of conversations, professional to professional, president to prime minister. We will continue those conversations. We have been very clear about where we stand, and we've also been clear that we're here to actually offer constructive ideas for how to proceed with this in a way that will ultimately achieve the objective. One of the points I made at the outset that I think bears repeating is that really any military operation, a targeted operation, a larger operation on the ground or in the air, has got to be connected to a strategic endgame that also answers the question, what comes next? And that's something that we're really bearing in on with the Israeli government, and feel that there needs to be more attention on that piece of it, lest we end up in a circumstance where Israel conducts a military operation, kills a bunch of Hamas guys, also creates some harm to innocent civilians caught in the crossfire, and then terrorists come back, as we have seen them come back in Gaza City and Khan Yunis and other places. We want to avoid that outcome. We want an outcome in which the page gets turned from Hamas's terroristic reign over Gaza, and a better future comes for the Palestinian people and for the security of the state of Israel. That's what we're going to keep working through. Yeah.
Thanks, Jay. I know you don't previously haven't wanted to talk about drawing red lines, but Israel is continuing to strike Rafah, and they're continuing to order the evacuation of large numbers of civilians. So how will you assess when it has crossed over into a full-scale offensive from the current, operations that are happening now?
We're watching this very closely, as you are. We're consulting closely with the Israelis. We're collecting our own assessment of what's happening on the ground. The Israeli Defense Forces have indicated to us that the operations they are currently pursuing are targeted. They are not the kind of massive military operation that we have talked about. We'll make our own judgment on that as we see things unfold, and it will be based on a totality of factors. It's not a mathematical formula or a mechanical determination. It's something we will judge based on what we see, and the president will then make his determinations. We have not seen that happen yet.
National Security Adviser Jake Sullivan at the White House news conference today. Story from The Hill. House Republicans are taking aim at President Biden's handling of the Israel-Hamas war this week after the administration paused shipment of some bombs to Israel and warned that the U.S. will cut off more offensive weapons to Jerusalem if its forces launch an invasion into Rafah. Republicans in both chambers have sharply criticized the administration's latest moves, accusing the president of abandoning the U.S.'s closest ally amid its war against Hamas, as he faces pressure from progressive lawmakers and voters. House GOP lawmakers, however, are poised to put those frustrations into action this week, voting on a bill that condemns the Biden administration's decision to pause arms transfers to Israel and calls for the expeditious delivery of offensive weapons to Jerusalem. That was from The Hill. Back to the White House briefing, the press secretary Karine Jean-Pierre asked specifically about this bill.
The House is likely to vote on the Israel Security Assistance Support Act later this week, which would ban the administration from withholding military aid to Israel that has been congressionally approved. Is that something that, it's obviously a response to the president's comments over the last week, so is that something that the White House would oppose? Are you talking to Democrats who might be inclined to go with Republicans on this?
So look, I'll start off, I just repeated basically what I wanted to say to this question, which is this president has been very clear. His commitment to Israel's security is ironclad. That has not changed. We share Israel's goal of defeating Hamas, and will continue to stand with Israel to make that happen. We've been very clear. As it relates to the announcement that the president made in the interview last week on CNN, we have paused only one shipment. That includes 2,000 pounds bombs, which can be very destructive in densely populated urban environments, such as Rafah. You heard, obviously, Jake just speak to this. And then so regarding this bill, as you just asked me about, Sungmin, we strongly, strongly oppose attempts to constrain the president's ability to deploy U.S. security assistance consistent with U.S. foreign policy and national security objectives. It is our objective as well that we plan to spend every last cent appropriated consistent with legal obligations, including in the recent supplemental, that national security supplemental that was just passed and the president obviously signed. We are committed to that to that supplemental, so that has not changed.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre taking reporters' questions today. CQ Roll Call reports on that bill that the House is expected to vote on this week, titled the Israel Security Assistance Support Act, saying the bill prohibits the use of funds to withhold military aid to Israel, requires the administration to certify to Congress that any withheld aid has been spent, and condemns the Biden administration's decision to pause certain arms transfers to Israel. Congressman Corey Mills, Republican from Florida, is going further, sponsoring articles of impeachment against President Biden for threatening to withhold aid to Israel. Congressman Mills was interviewed today on the Fox Business Channel.
It's an obvious this for that, a quid pro quo, or what's now should be called a quid pro Joe. We have seen where in Michigan during the Democrat primary, 13.2% filed as uncommitted. That's 101,457 votes. He now sees the pro-Hamas sympathizers who are across the country protesting on university campuses as well as blocking streets. He sees the recent polls, which shows President Trump up in all the swing states to include a 1.2% on average increase in Michigan. This is a clear understanding. He knew what the Israeli supplemental aid package would include. He knew that once this was congressionally appropriated aid funding, that it was supposed to move forward. And instead, he pulled the wool over the eyes of the American people by sending the first shipment, which was taken by Hamas, which is being utilized by their fighters and also to be sold off to help with the counteroffensive, while withholding weapons shipments to the IDF and to Israel in exchange for political gain in the elections. So as far as I'm concerned, I use 98% of Representative Jerry Nadler's own language that he used to impeach President Trump for a very similar action. The difference is that it's not an accusation. This is actually something that has taken place by Biden and his administration.
Congressman Corey Mills, Republican from Florida, on Fox Business Channel today on his articles of impeachment. Story from Reuters. The Biden administration on Friday said Israel might have violated international humanitarian law by using U.S.-supplied weapons during its military operation in Gaza, in its strongest criticism to date of Israel. But the administration stopped short of a definitive assessment, saying that due to the chaos of the war in Gaza, it could not verify specific instances where use of those weapons might have been involved in alleged breaches. That was the story from Reuters. The State Department deputy spokesperson Vedant Patel today was asked about that report.
I gotta go to the memo that was released on Friday, the December 20th. I'm sure lots of people have questions on it. In it, the State Department says it's reasonable to assess that there could be violations, but of course saying not that there's no evidence of it. If it's reasonable to assess that there are violations, how does this affect the State Department planning going forward? Should there be greater concern, greater restrictions potentially on weapons going forward?
So there's no policy change to announce, Sean. What the report makes clear is that first, to take a little bit of a step back, the report makes clear that this is a very complex and complicated battlefield. It is a very dense and urban setting. We are also dealing with a belligerent, in this case Hamas, that has a clear track record and history of co-locating itself with civilians and civilian infrastructure, using civilians as human shields. We've also made clear in the report that the IDF has undertaken steps to implement international humanitarian law obligations for the protections of civilians in the current conflict, including requirements that are related to distinction, proportionality, and others. But we also are clear in our report that it's reasonable to assess that defense articles covered under the National Security Memorandum have been used by Israeli security forces in instances that are inconsistent with its IHL obligations. But we also have no direct indication of Israel intentionally targeting civilians. But to take a step back, Sean, and I guess this addresses kind of your broader question, a country's overall commitment to international humanitarian law is not necessarily disproven by what may be individual IHL violations. And the most important thing here is that Israel does have a number of ongoing active criminal investigations pending, and there are hundreds of other cases under administrative review. Israel has taken steps to and is taking steps to hold itself and its actions accountable. Simultaneously, we also continue to have tools at our disposal that existed before the National Security Memorandum and existed afterwards. Things like the Turg process, the Leahy process, the conventional arms transfer policy, end-use monitoring, and other things to continue to assess and continue to look into instances that are reported to us that may be concerning. The same can be said about humanitarian aid. We continue to monitor that situation very closely and will continue to assess the government of Israel by its actions as it relates to humanitarian aid.
State Department Deputy Spokesperson Vedant Patel at the State Department briefing in Washington. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was interviewed on Dan Senior's podcast, Call Me Back, released on Sunday. The Prime Minister was asked about protecting civilians in Gaza.
John Spencer is in charge of urban warfare in West Point, and he said, I can't find any parallel to that. In Mosul, there were 3,000 to 5,000 terrorists. We're facing 35,000 Hamas terrorists. We've killed already about 14,000, wounded many others, and we're progressing towards that goal. In Fallujah, you didn't see it. And in many ways, the only parallel that John Spencer could give, he says there is somewhat of a parallel, which is the battle for Manila in World War II. Why is that parallel? First of all, understand that what Israel has done is take the effort to minimize civilian casualties as no other army has done. We use leaflets, we use millions of text messages, phone calls. We actually call the people, give up the benefit of surprise, tell them, get out of the way. So get out of the war zone so that we can accomplish our military objectives while you're in a safe place. Hamas is doing everything it can to keep them in the war zone. We do everything to get them out of harm's way. They do everything to keep them in harm's way, including using gunfire. They actually shoot their own civilians trying to keep them there because for them, for us, every civilian casualty is a tragedy. For them, every civilian casualty is a strategy. So they don't give a hoot about their civilians, and they're responsible for those deaths. But nevertheless, even though we're faced with such a cynical enemy, we've been able to keep the ratio of civilians to combatants killed. Again, everyone is a tragedy, but it's a ratio of about 1-to-1 now. 14,000 have been killed, combatants, and probably around 16,000 civilians have been killed. That's not the ratio that you had in Fallujah or in Mosul, where the difficulties you faced were far smaller.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on a podcast with host Dan Senior. It was posted Sunday. Hamas-led Gazan government has said that 35,000 civilians have now been killed in the war. Story from the New York Times. Israel's Memorial Day is normally one of the most somber on the country's calendar, a date when Israelis put aside their differences to grieve fellow citizens killed in war or terrorist attacks. As Israelis gathered across the country on Monday for the first national day of mourning since the Hamas-led October 7th attacks, protesters disrupted several ceremonies by heckling government ministers. Their interventions underscored how feelings of wartime unity have given way to deep disputes over the war in Gaza, the fate of hostages taken on October 7th, and domestic politics. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was heckled by critics as he attended a memorial at Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, the site of Israel's national cemetery. One person was heard shouting, "Garbage." Another said, "You took my children." That was from the New York Times. And this is Washington Today. Maryland voters on Tuesday will be choosing nominees for the open U.S. Senate seat. Democrat Ben Cardin, the incumbent, is not running again. And on the Republican side, former Governor Larry Hogan has a sizable lead in the polls. For the Democrats, it's a tight race between Congressman David Trone and Prince George's County Executive Angela Alsobrooks. Those latter two have posted Get Out the Vote videos.
Hey there, folks. Election day is just hours away. We've already sent out mailers, knocked on doors, and spoken with so many of you across Maryland. But there's one more thing I can do. Remind you to get out there and vote. The polls are open tomorrow, 7 a.m. until 8 p.m. From abortion rights to health care and the future of our democracy, everything is on the line. We need your voice. This link has all the information you need, including where to find your polling location, where to drop off your ballot, and everything else you need to vote. Thanks to everyone on Team Trone for all your hard work and support to get us here. Now let's go win this.
I've got exciting news. I'm here with my friend Angela Alsobrooks. I'm supporting her for the U.S. Senate. She's going to deliver for the people of Maryland every day as United States Senator, at the same time that she's going to be defending democracy and freedom against Donald Trump and the MAGA right. If Larry Hogan were to go to the Senate, he would be another brick in the wall for Donald Trump and his party. Who do we want on the floor of the U.S. Senate defending women's right to choose? I want Angela Alsobrooks. Who do we want defending the right of the people to vote? I want Angela Alsobrooks. This is not a time when anybody can afford to sit on the sidelines. I'm asking my friends all over Maryland to join the campaign for Angela Alsobrooks for U.S. Senate. She's going to be a great U.S. Senator.
Thank you so much to Congressman Raskin for his tremendous leadership. He represents so beautifully the principles not only of democracy, but of integrity, decency, dignity, equality, all of the things that our country really stands for. And so I want to thank you so much.
With a closer look at Tuesday's Maryland primary for the U.S. Senate seat, joining us on the phone from Baltimore is Pamela Wood, state politics reporter with the Baltimore Banner. Thanks for being with us. A very close race on the Democratic side between David Trone and Angela Alsobrooks. What are you seeing there?
Yeah, it's actually turned out to be a pretty exciting Democratic primary here in Maryland for the U.S. Senate. You've got Angela Alsobrooks. She's the county executive of Prince George's County. It's the second largest county in the state. And then you have Congressman David Trone, who represents a suburban district in Maryland, a few terms in the House, and they are going at it, and it's close, and not sure what's going to happen on Tuesday.
What issues have been driving that race?
So what's interesting here is that policy-wise, these two Democrats, they're basically in sync on everything. They have the same views on protecting reproductive rights, immigration reform, achieving peace in Gaza, and the like. So this is really coming down to sort of experience, personality. They've been going back and forth on how they're funding the race. David Trone is incredibly wealthy and has self-funded to the tune of more than $60 million. which has been an attack point from Alsobrooks. Alsobrooks, meanwhile, gets criticized by Trone for taking, PAC and corporate money. But perhaps most of all is they're fighting over who is the best to beat the Republican nominee, which is likely to be former Governor Larry Hogan.
Well, we'll get to that in a second. On David Trone and Angela Alsobrooks, it's been interesting how the endorsements have been split among the major names in Maryland.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Angela Alsobrooks really very early locked up endorsements from much of the Democratic establishment here in Maryland. She has Governor Wes Moore behind her. She has Senator Chris Van Hollen, who, will be the colleague of whoever wins here. She also has most of the congressional delegation. David Trone, meanwhile, he does have Congressman Dutch Ruppersberger from the Baltimore area. He also has a number of his colleagues in the House from around the country and also in leadership, Hakeem Jeffries and, his group there. So they've been going back and forth on that a lot in the race. And they both have a variety of sort of lower level officials, county officials, town council members, state lawmakers, and the like.
You mentioned Larry Hogan, former governor, the likely winner of the Republican primary tomorrow. He is ahead in the polls. What does a general matchup look like with either David Trone or Angela Alsobrooks?
Yeah, well, my goodness, whatever it's going to be competitive. It's going to get a lot of attention. Maryland, for once, matters a lot. Look, Maryland has not sent a Democrat to the U.S. Senate in something like 40 years. Now there is a competitive Republican candidate. Governor Hogan is popular. He had good approval ratings. He has money. National money is going to flow in here on both sides, Democrats and Republicans, because, the balance of power in the Senate is hanging in the balance here. Maryland could be one of those states that could decide it. So there's going to be a lot of attention. The latest polling of hypothetical general election matchups came out last week from Emerson College. It showed either Alsobrooks or Trone could beat Larry Hogan, but other polling has shown Hogan beating either one of them. I think it's a little too early to say until we have a nominee on the Democratic side.
On this final day before the primary voting, where are you heading? Where are the candidates spending their last few hours?
Yeah, well, I'm fortunate. I'm a Baltimore-based reporter, and they are both here in Baltimore. I am about to hit a campaign stop with Angela Alsobrooks. She has been linking up with a bunch of her local politicians who've endorsed her, and she's doing 3 or 4 stops in Baltimore today. Later on, I'm going to meet up with David Trone. He is going to be at a bar near the Orioles Stadium. Local folks in the D.C. area or Baltimore may know Pickles Pub, very famous. So he's going to be meeting and greeting in Baltimore, which, it's a major population center. There are a lot of Democratic voters here in Baltimore. So they are, definitely not passing it over and putting some focus here in Baltimore.
Pamela Wood, Baltimore Banner state politics reporter. You can find her stories at baltimorebanner.com and on X at pwoodreporter. Thank you very much. And from the Washington Post, Attorney General Merrick Garland warned Monday of mounting violent threats against election workers across the country and vowed the Justice Department will be relentless in prosecuting those who threaten the democratic process. Speaking to reporters ahead of a meeting of the department's Election Threats Task Force, Garland cited a handful of cases over the past several years in which poll workers in Arizona, Michigan, and Georgia, swing states in the presidential election, have faced death threats. In each instance, he said federal prosecutors won convictions against the perpetrators and sentences of up to 3.5 years in federal prison. Reporting from the Washington Post, here is the Attorney General, Merrick Garland.
We're meeting today for the same reason I launched this task force 3 years ago. We have seen a dangerous increase in violent threats against public servants, the ones who administer our elections. Those threats endanger our democracy itself. That is why over the past 3 years, we have accelerated our efforts to combat the increase in threats against election workers, officials, and volunteers that followed the 2020 election. Our Election Threats Task Force has secured the guilty plea of a man who threatened an election worker in Michigan. The defendant made vile threats, saying that the election worker deserved a, quote, throat to the knife. We secured a 3.5-year prison sentence for a man in Texas who threatened the lives of Arizona election officials and their children and advocated for a mass shooting of poll workers and election workers in precincts he believed had, quote, suspect results. We secured a 3.5-year prison sentence for a Massachusetts man for sending a bomb threat to an elections official in the Arizona Secretary of State's office. We secured a 2-year prison sentence for a man in Texas who threatened Georgia officials in the wake of the 2020 election, including threatening to, quote, put a bullet behind the ears of an election worker. And we secured a 2.5-year sentence in prison for an Iowa man who threatened to lynch an election official in Arizona. Each of these cases should serve as a warning. If you threaten to harm or kill an election worker, volunteer, or official, the Justice Department will find you, and we will hold you accountable. The public servants who administer our elections must be able to do their jobs without fearing for their safety or that of their families. We will aggressively investigate and prosecute those who threaten election workers.
Attorney General Merrick Garland at today's Election Threats Task Force meeting. Also there, the FBI Director Christopher Wray and the Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco. Washington Post article reporting on this reads, justice officials emphasize that they are also monitoring emerging threats, including the use of artificial intelligence to spread disinformation and propagate threats behind technology that can mask identities of perpetrators. Lisa Monaco said violent threats using AI are still violent threats. In these cases, the Department of Justice will seek enhanced sentences. A threat to any election official, worker, or volunteer is, at bottom, a threat to our democracy. That reporting from the Washington Post. And Washington Today continues in a moment.
Hi, it's Kayla from C-SPAN. Imagine 45 years ago when there was just a handful of television networks. C-SPAN first went on the air bringing an unfiltered view of government directly to America's living rooms. No spin, no commentary, just pure democracy in action.
And it's Greta from C-SPAN. It was a bold experiment. We finally had a front row seat to Congress, the White House, and the campaign trail, all without government funding.
As we celebrate 45 years and a legacy of unfiltered access, we ask for your support of a donation in honor of our 4 decades of service. Your gift, no matter how big or small, will help maintain this vital resource for access to the democratic process.
You can help ensure another 45 years of witnessing history unfold and empowering citizens to be informed and engaged in the political process. Visit cspan.org/donate today and join our 45th anniversary campaign.
Thank you for supporting C-SPAN, your unfiltered view of government. Visit cspan.org/donate today to make your gift of support. Thank you.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you find your podcasts. From Reuters, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission approved rules on Monday in a 2-to-1 vote that set new requirements for moving electricity across states and covering the costs of new transmission projects, which will play a key role in the Biden administration's goal of decarbonizing the economy by 2050. The FERC's rule on regional transmission planning and cost allocation has been under development for nearly 2 years. It is meant to ensure the U.S. power grid is resilient and able to deliver reliable, clean energy to meet growing U.S. demand amid the explosion of electric vehicles, data centers, and artificial intelligence, boosted by tax incentives in President Biden's 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. The queue of power generation projects awaiting a connection to the electric grid is currently around 2,600 gigawatts, twice the amount of generation of the current U.S. power plant fleet. That was from Reuters. The chair of FERC posted a video after the vote.
Hello, I'm Willie Phillips, chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Our country's aging grid is being tested in ways that we've never seen before. And without significant action now, we may not be able to use it reliably in the face of increasing demand, extreme weather, and new and changing technologies. That's why I'm excited to tell you that the Commission has taken historic action. Here's what we did. With the need for energy surging, we must plan for the long term. That starts today. We need to consider a broad set of benefits when planning for new transmission. That's reliability and economic benefits, and the benefits of using advanced technologies for all customers to get the most out of our grid. As a former state regulator, I know state leaders must be and will be at the table working together to select new transmission projects, how to pay for them, and how to get them built. And while we're on the subject of paying for transmission projects, let me be clear. If you don't benefit from a transmission project, you will not have to pay for it, period. 100 years ago, at this very table, the Federal Power Commission took historic action to help electrify a growing and ambitious America. In that same spirit, we take historic action to help secure the energy needs for a modern and prosperous 21st century American economy. I'm proud of the work that it took to get us here. And as your chairman, I will do everything I can, everything possible, to help secure a reliable, affordable, and sustainable energy system that we all need. So let's seize the moment. Our grid cannot wait. Our communities cannot wait. America cannot wait.
FERC Chair Willie Phillips putting out that video after today's FERC meeting, the vote for the new electricity transmission rules passing 2-1. During the meeting, the no vote came from Commissioner Mark Christie.
Now, there are a lot of reasons to vote against this final rule, but one of the biggest single reason for me that I'm dissenting is the state role. Contrary to what you heard, the state role has been essentially gutted from the role that was promised by the NOPR. Again, that NOPR was a compromise, and here's the basic element of it. It was fairly simple, actually. If this commission is going to mandate long-term planning, mandate a plethora of inputs on that long-term planning, and was going to mandate how and who pays for trillions of dollars of transmission projects, and was going to throw into one bucket reliability projects, economic projects, public policy projects, and corporate and projects designed to implement a corporation's preferred power purchases. If all that's going to happen, then the state should have the authority to consent to the details of the planning. And most importantly, consent to the details of the cost allocation. That was the essence of the compromise. That's why I voted for it, and I said so at the time, right here at this table. And the reason I insisted on that role for the states was one reason: consumer protection. State regulators set retail rates. Retail rates are what consumers pay in their monthly bills. And as a state regulator for 17 years, I know that state regulators care deeply about protecting the consumers in their own states. As a state regulator, when you raise retail rates, you have to live among the people on whom you just raise their cost of living. And you know a lot of them are already struggling to meet and pay their monthly bills. And electric power is most definitely a necessity of life today. And when you raise their monthly power bills, you hear about it at the grocery store. You hear about it at the high school football games. Whenever you talk to your neighbors, and you care about those people whose power bills you just raised because they're your neighbors. So state consent was the heart of the NOPR compromise, but this final rule is not a compromise. The special interests and their lobbyists did not want states getting in the way of this agenda. So the provisions for state consent to planning criteria, and most importantly to regional cost allocation, have effectively been eliminated. Instead, here's what we have. We have a charade of state involvement. We have a lot of empty rhetoric about listening to states, seeking their views, letting states, quote, inform, unquote, the decisions, but don't be fooled. It's a charade. The principle of state consent to planning criteria and cost allocation has been effectively done away with.
Mark Christie is a commissioner with FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, at today's meeting before a 2-1 vote to approve the new transmission rules. FERC says that the reforms received over 30,000 pages of comments, the largest public record ever considered by the commission. The U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, called a teleconference to welcome the passage of these new rules.
The clean energy incentives included in the Inflation Reduction Act have been a huge success, but much of that success would be lost without the ability to bring power from places that generate renewable energy to communities all across the country. A new historic advancement in our transmission policies has been desperately needed, and the rules released by FERC today will go a long way, a very long way, to solving that problem. Simply put, these new rules will mean more low-cost, reliable clean energy for the places that need it most. As many of you know, last year I pushed FERC to deliver a historic advancement in transmission policies that would lower costs and improve reliability by getting clean energy from where it is produced to where people live. I applaud FERC for recognizing the need to address this critical issue and acting to build upon the historic achievements of Senate Democrats to make our energy grid cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable. These new rules, together with the Inflation Reduction Act, will deliver lower costs for American families, cleaner air for our communities, and a brighter future for the youngest generation and beyond. That's exactly what we need to see the clean energy revolution we catalyzed with the IRA come to fruition. FERC's actions will help to fundamentally improve our power grid in the wake of the IRA.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on a teleconference. One of the reporters that tuned in, Joshua Siegel, Politico's energy and climate Congress reporter, posting on X after, wow, Senator Schumer on press call celebrating FERC's big transmission rules today tells me I've told Joe Manchin it's going to be virtually impossible to get something done on broader permitting reform in Congress this year due to GOP opposition to doing anything on transmission. He's referring to Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat of West Virginia. Here is that exchange.
Obviously, Energy Chair Joe Manchin is talking with his counterpart John Barrasso on permitting, and they've been outspoken about trying to reach a deal this year. I mean, what's been your approach to those talks? I mean, it's not you're skeptical.
I'm happy to listen. I'm happy to listen, but I've told Joe Manchin it's going to be virtually impossible to get something done.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer on a teleconference. From ABC News, President Joe Biden is expected to quadruple tariffs on electric vehicles from China from roughly 25% to 100% and raise other tariffs on key industries, including semiconductors, solar, and batteries, in an announcement Tuesday, according to a source familiar with the decision. The decision was made after a years-long required review of the tariffs that former President Donald Trump imposed on some $300 billion of imports. Most of those Trump-era tariffs will remain in place. By implementing a steep increase in EV tariffs, the Biden administration aims to prevent a flood of cars made in China from hitting the U.S. market, a market China has not been a significant player in up to this point. That was from ABC News. The Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was interviewed about this today on Bloomberg Television.
Does the U.S. want a trade war, though, with China? We believe that we should have a deep and productive, and that we do in most areas, trade and investment relationship. We're working to stabilize our economic relationship. We do not wish to disengage from China economically, but we do think that the playing field should be fair. And China engages in unfair practices like massive subsidies of industries they've decided are critical. And those are cases where we will act to protect ourselves. We've seen Beijing in the past, though, respond, and it's become tit for tat. Are you expecting a response? Could they go after Tesla or maybe American farm products? Well, President Biden believes that anything we do should be targeted to our concerns and not broad-based. And hopefully we will not see a significant Chinese response, but that's always a possibility.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen on Bloomberg Television today talking about an expected announcement as early as Tuesday about increasing tariffs on products from China, including EVs, batteries, solar panels. From NPR, the U.S. Treasury ran a surplus last month thanks to the April 15th tax deadline, but the federal government is still on track to end the fiscal year more than $1.5 trillion in the red. April tax receipts totaled $776 billion, a 22% increase from the previous year. Treasury officials credited part of the jump to the growing number of people working and rising wages. Government spending for the month rose 23% from a year ago, with the biggest increase, $26 billion, coming from higher interest payments on the federal debt. Interest payments have gone up as a result of both rising debt and today's high interest rates. That was from NPR. The director of the Congressional Budget Office, Philip Swagel, spoke about federal budgets and debt at a conference today in Washington that was held at the American Enterprise Institute.
The deficit is wide, even though the economy is doing reasonably well, right? And that's really what's unusual, right? We're past the pandemic. The fiscal response to the pandemic is mostly behind us. There's still outlays going out, of course, but the sort of emergency 2020 fiscal response is largely behind us, and yet the deficit is still wide. Now, this was the case before the pandemic as well. You can see on the chart, if you look, just before the pandemic spike in the deficit, that in 2019 we also had a structural deficit. The economy is strong. People throughout the income distribution were seeing rising incomes, and we had a structural deficit. So that's it's both familiar, but it's just different. It's different than the large deficits we've had in the past. The other thing you can see in the chart is the rising share of net interest outlays in the deficit. And one could say, well, look, interest rates have come up a bit, but in the future, interest rates will could go back down, and so that's not a problem. We all know about the sort of R minus G type arguments. And the challenge is that R minus G helps some, if that goes in the right direction. It helps with moderate primary deficits, but the primary deficit is no longer moderate and is not set to be moderate out into the future. Now, the numbers here are based on our February 2024 budget and economic outlook. We are working now on the spring update. The spring goes through June 20th, so I'm pretty confident it will be spring, but it will be late spring. And so there will be new numbers. And I'm going to talk about some of the fiscal numbers in things that are already public. So I'm not going to go into the analysis we haven't finished. But I think the bottom line is that the next update is going to show a wider deficit. That in some sense, there's things that we know already that make it that the fiscal situation is probably worse than it looks. And this is already, it's already pretty difficult, but it's probably worse than, it's more difficult, worse than it looks. The second chart, again, is familiar, showing the debt to GDP ratio going off to infinity. I promise it doesn't get better if you go past 30 years. And, we have now what we begin to call the 250% problem, which is, well, at some point, right, the debt to GDP ratio can get to a high enough value that you kind of have to look at it and think, really, is that is it meaningful at that point? And we've decided to truncate our y-axis now at 250% of GDP. So this one doesn't have it, but if you do a few negative shocks, then you can get a worse debt to GDP ratio.
Congressional Budget Office Director Philip Swagel at a conference in Washington today held at the American Enterprise Institute and co-organized by the Penn Wharton Budget Model, the Brookings Institution, and the Birch Center for Tax Policy and Public Finance, with, according to the organizers, experts from academia, government, and industry to discuss the federal government's current fiscal track, its causes and consequences, and what can be done to put us back on a sustainable path. You can find the full video at our video library, cspan.org. On Wall Street today, the Dow down 81, NASDAQ up 47, S&P down 1. Vice President Kamala Harris used profanity today to make a point at the annual Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies Legislative Leadership Summit in Washington. Interviewer Jimmy O. Yang, comedian and actor, asked the vice president to reflect on her experience as the first vice president of the U.S. of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander heritage.
Especially the young people here, I say to you, when you walk in those rooms, being the only one that looks like you, the only one with your background, you walk in those rooms chin up, shoulders back, be it a meeting room, a boardroom, a courtroom, a hearing room. You walk in those rooms knowing that we are all in that room with you, applauding you on, and expecting certain things from you, including that you will not be silent in those rooms. And that we expect that from you because we also expect that you will internalize and know we're there with you. And so your voice can be strong. It is, as Alicia said, my mother would say to me, don't you ever let anybody tell you who you are. You tell them who you are. Don't ever carry as a personal burden your capacity to do whatever you dream and aspire to do based on other people's limited ability to see who can do what. This is part of what's involved, is that we have to know that sometimes people will open the door for you and leave it open, sometimes they won't. And then you need to kick that door down. Excuse my language.
We're going to make T-shirts with that saying, kick the door down. I mean, I literally just got emotional listening to that. Like, I think all of us in this room have that experience.
Vice President Kamala Harris with Jimmy O. Yang, comedian and actor at the annual Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies Legislative Leadership Summit held at the Washington, D.C. Convention Center. And yes, the profanity was removed. You can find the original at our video library, cspan.org. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter Word for Word and get the stories making headlines in Washington sent to your inbox every day. Sign up at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.